And now, coming soon to video cassette.
Reach across time and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. For every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
This is the story of the American cowboy, which is the story of America. We know him as the American cowboy, perhaps our most enduring icon. He embodies the spirit and freedom of an entire nation, a man close to the land, able to rise above overwhelming odds, to do the right thing. But who is he? A movie star or a hired hand? Most of what we know about the real cowboy is clouded by myth, folklore, and pure media invention. How did a common laborer on a horse end up becoming a model of rugged individualism and democracy? What makes him so appealing to so many people in the world? That's our journey, to separate fact and fiction in search of the most inspiring character of our time, the real American cowboy. Who is this cowboy? Where is he from? How did he become our quintessential American hero? He's so much a part of this country now, most of us have never wondered where he came from. We just grew up with him and forgot to ask ourselves why. We fell in love with him many years ago, and the affair never ended. On the large and small screens across America, he was our own noble knight on horseback, our protector, our savior. He did it with such calculated grace and style. How could we ever forget him? He went by many names: Roy, Gene, and John. There was nothing he couldn't do. He could ride like the wind. He could sing. He could tame the entire Wild West and make us feel safe. How could we not fall in love with him? And how could we not wish, even for a brief moment, that we could be just like him?
How long have you been since you've ridden?
Like these folks. They're from all over the globe, and they're chasing the same dream. They want to be cowboys, So they've signed on for a cattle drive in the Bighorn Mountains on the Montana-Wyoming border. It won't be easy. They'll spend a couple of weeks in the saddle, working all the way, sleeping under the stars, giving up showers. But that's exactly why they came.
What brought me out here is the European fascination for the vastness of the land, big sky, the possibility of going horseback riding for days at a time, complete isolation, no cell phones, no laptops, no voicemail, no nothing. Absolute pleasure for an entire week.
One of the real cowboys here is Hip Tillett. He's seen a lot of greenhorns in his day, and he understands the fascination.
Oh, I think from the time they were little kids, maybe they watched television and watched the westerns, and maybe they like horses, and they put it all together, and it might look a little bit romantic to them.
I came over here because the riding out here is so different from home. There's so much space, and you're working the cattle, and the horses are really a tool instead of a pet.
They're trying to relive an image that started a century and a half ago. And these folks are living proof it's still going strong. We'll see if the greenhorns like the reality of a cattle drive better than the romantic notion that brought them here. And along about now, that reality ought to be coming right up through the saddle. We'll check back on them.
Cowboy, in real life, is a hired man on horseback. He's a low-paid wage earner, has been from the start, is today. Doesn't see himself as that. I think primarily because he rides a horse.
It's the way of life, and it's the independent spirit. And of course, cowboys never made any money. They loved the life, or they wouldn't have done it. And so the guys that did that, the guys that went with the cattle drives, and they had the right look and the eye to do it, because it was tough.
A hired man on horseback. But that hired man seemed bigger than life. He was the product of free grassland and fertile imagination. Isolated out there on the frontier, his unique lifestyle would attract the attention of storytellers who saw much more than a hired hand. He may be America's hero, but his roots go back much farther. As it turns out, the word cowboy actually comes from Ireland around 1000 AD, where herders tended cattle. About 600 years later, their British rulers didn't see these Irish cowboys as knights, but as rogues. They were given a choice of jail or being sent to America. Not a hard choice. The vast American landscape would become a stage where the real cowboy would eventually redefine his place in the world. He would become the main act for Hollywood westerns, hero of dime novels. And he was also much more. He had many faces. And he had been rehearsing for centuries. braided leather, a sombrero, the ring of spurs, the caballero.
The first cowboys in the New World were, of course, Spanish and later Mexican vaqueros, and we owe these cultures a great debt for methods of working cattle, their horsemanship, their ability to handle the riata and lasso, and so much of what we have associated with American cowboys was handed to them through vaqueros.
The mounted Spaniards followed a long ancestry of world-class horsemen that also included strong ties to the Africans and Moors by virtue of Mediterranean trade routes. Centuries of skill had evolved into a remarkable style of equestrian culture. In the early United States, the Spanish hands on the horse and cow would evolve again. As the first major European power in the Americas, Spain introduced the horse and the cow into Mexico, hundreds of years before the birth of the American cowboy. Much of who the cowboy is today, from his clothing to his equipment, to roping and riding techniques and even language, comes from Spanish ancestry. The Spanish influence spread steadily with the permanent string of missions that were first established northward into New Mexico and Texas. They were strung like pearls along a series of trails known as El Camino Real, the King's Highway. Stretching in parallel lines along the Texas coast and its vast interior, El Camino Real would also take you through the mountain passes to Santa Fe.
The Spanish vaquero, when they moved up from what is now Mexico into what is now the United States and California and Texas, influenced the Americans who then arrived in those areas. And the Americans studied them, they watched them work, and they adopted the tools and the techniques of the Spanish vaquero, and then in time modified them for their own uses.
Above all, the vaquero was a highly skilled horseman who would learn to actually become one with his horse. This relationship played an important part of the cowboy culture. In the early 1800s, adventurer, explorer Josiah Gregg was one of many who remembered the caballero, the gentleman on horse, so vividly.
The riding costume generally consists of the sombrero, a peculiarly shaped low-crowned hat with a wide brim surmounted with a band of tinsel cord, nearly an inch in diameter. A jacket of cloth gaudily embroidered with braid and fancy. A curiously shaped article called calzoneras, intended for pantaloons, with the outer part of the leg open from hip to ankle. The garment is supported by a rich sash, which is drawn very tightly around the body and contributes materially to render the appearance of the caballero extremely picturesque.
Complete with a serape and leggings called botas, the forerunner of the protective chaps. The Spanish cowboy had established a style that was so admired, it would soon be copied by his American counterpart. The vaquero also had the substance that matched his showy appearance. His horse was protected by heavy leather skirting while working cattle in the dry and harsh environment. Like a ghost rider, the vaquero persists even today.
Hey!
We find the descendants of this noble horseman still working cattle in Texas.
Yep.
just as the bloodlines run pure in this Santa Gertrudis breed, Vaquero blood runs fast in these cowboys.
The origin of the King Ranch traced back to Captain Richard King, an Irish boy from New York who was indentured as a tailor, ran away, went to sea, worked his way up, and eventually was a riverboat captain on the Rio Grande River during the Mexican War. Took some of the profits and rode north, stopped at the first running water, the Santa Gertrudis Creek, and purchased the land and began an empire.
After Captain King bought his land, he needed cattle. So he rode down across the border to a small community in Mexico and bought some. But as he headed back to Texas, his conscience hit him.
As he was driving the cattle away, he realized that he was taking the livelihood of the people. And so he went back and he hired the whole community and brought them up. And that began the Caneños.
Calling themselves Los Caneños, the King's Men, they brought with them the vaquero tradition of the centuries-old culture of horsemen and cattle. The descendants of these original villagers from Mexico have formed the core of the King Ranch workforce ever since. Today, one of the largest ranches in the United States, the King Ranch covers 825,000 acres along the South Texas coast. That's a big ranch.
One of the first things people always ask me when I find out that I'm a cattleman is how many cattle we run. And I always say, well, how much money do you have in the bank? It's sort of considered an impolite question to ask a cattleman. But we probably have an inventory of 60 to 70,000 head of cattle.
On this late October morning, the Caneños are sorting cattle for shipment. It looks like a well-choreographed dance. To a cowboy, this is the Major League, nature's own symphony orchestra. Both men and horses have done this work before. Like their ancestors before them, they know their roles. A graceful ballet that's in their blood.
The relationship of us and our horses is you work as one instead of two, your horse doing one thing and you doing another. It's just teamwork as one. So you can get along with your horse and the horse gets along with you and you'll work just fine.
Almost all of the vaqueros were born on the ranch. Some of them go back 5 families.
Of course, I've been here for 5 generations and really enjoy this. My dad was out here as a boy. He was born and raised here, the same way I was. And my grandfather was also out here. Like I say, my roots go back to 5 generations, and I don't think I'd do anything else. I really love this.
The Caneños have been the true American cowboy. They spend many hours on horse. They know this ranch. Some of our pastures are 20, 30,000 acres. They're as big as a big city. And so there is an innate knowledge of this ranch that comes from a lifetime of being here.
There's no school that teaches you how to be a cowboy or the burning desire to become one. It just sort of comes on you and won't go away.
Of course, being a cowboy is a lot of fun. You get to be around old cowboys like Cheche here, and he He really knows what he's doing. I've learned a lot from him. He's a good man. And being here is just part of me. I really love it.
And here's why Chiche knows what he's doing.
Lo que hace bueno uno es aprender a saber el trabajo.
Well, what makes one good is to learn to do the work and to put care in what we do, and then you will feel more driven.
Entre más ya trabajas, más te gusta el trabajo de vaqueros.
The more you work, the more you enjoy the work of a cowboy.
The influence of the Mexican vaquero didn't stop in Texas. Soon, California had its own vaqueros and developed its own mission trail, following the coast from San Diego northward to what is now known as San Francisco. However, unlike the rustic and more primitive missions in Texas, the California missions prospered. And as the missions grew, so did the vaquero culture and his ranching system. Rancho Mission Viejo is one of the oldest and at one time largest ranches in California. And the vaquero tradition still runs strong.
Well, how has the California vaquero been perpetuated on this ranch? They're still here today. Down through the years, there were almost legendary, myth-like figures. The vaquero prides himself in his horsemanship, his skill in working cattle, his skill in roping, and we still have that here.
California has always been different. In fact, there was a time when the world firmly believed that it was really an island, kept isolated by Spain and almost inaccessible. Within this self-sufficient land of plenty, a wealthy culture of people called themselves Californios. When Anglos finally arrived in the 1840s, this vaquero influence was much too hard to resist. He would become known as the buckaroo. Starting with the gold rush, and even today, the buckaroo's style and pride can be found in many areas west of the Continental Divide. And it's not so much of a thing as it is an attitude.
The vaquero, oftentimes you'll hear him called vaquero. The buckaroo comes from that tradition, who were very high on the social scale. They were ornate. They used silver mountings on their bridles and on their bits and on their spurs. They were very proud people, and it was thought to be a very skilled occupation.
The buckaroo was mostly of white skin, and the vaquero came from the Indian and Mexican type people. But as time went on, those two ran together. They worked together, they lived together, ate together, and are married. That became one of the same, a vaquero and buckaroo.
The roots of the cowboy would be Spanish, but the harvest would have another face. That of the highlands of the British Isles. The two cultures met in the grasslands of America's West.
People from those areas came across the Atlantic, bringing with them ideas about how to raise cattle on the open range. They encountered each other, they mixed, they exchanged ideas.
And then, like a prairie firestorm, the Anglo cowboy was swept into a great civil war, leaving his crops, cattle, and land behind. Life stood still. But instead of dying off, the life of the cowboy would be stimulated by something he could never have predicted, and it would change him forever. If the American cowboy has a birthday, it would be right after the Civil War. It was during this time that cattle ranching in Texas took on giant proportions, and it had an enormous impact on the evolution of the cowboy. Confederate soldiers returned down and out and found their cattle in poor shape, but they had multiplied. So they had the product, beef, but the markets were way up north. It was here that the great cattle drives began taking cattle to the waiting Kansas railheads. These cowmen were ready to make their fortunes, but they had no idea what lay ahead. What lay ahead was the impossible. 600 miles of sagebrush, thorny mesquite, rivers to be crossed, hills to be climbed. Most of the way was fit only for rattlesnakes. They'd face days of choking dust, followed by dangerous, swollen rivers. All the while trying to herd wild cattle during the day and keep them from stampeding at night. And who would be fool enough to make this grueling journey? Kids, most of them 15 to 25. If you were 30, you were too old. They'd get out of the saddle only to eat and sleep. Each would have several horses. The mounts would rest, the cowboys wouldn't. It would be the most difficult thing they would ever do. They were runaways and drifters, displaced veterans and fugitives from justice. All sought sanctuary on the ranching frontier after the Civil War. For those who knew something about the cattle business, they might make $30 a month. For the greenhorns, maybe 20. Then came that morning when all the thinking came to an end. It was time to go. It was an epic undertaking. The movie makers recognized that early on, and they did a good job recreating it, leaning on the recollections of trail riders like Andy Adams.
With 6 men on each side and the herd strung out for 3/4 of a mile, it can only be compared with a Chinese dragon. As it moved forward, 2 riders known as point men directed the course of the herd. The main body trailed along behind the leaders like an army in loose marching order, guarded by outriders known as swing men.
At first, all they knew was to head north, from South Texas toward the nearest railroad, somewhere in Kansas. For a while, the best routes were mapped out and given names: Shawnee, Western, Goodnight Loving, and one other.
From Texas, as these drivers were moving northward, many of them began to follow a trail that had been laid out by a man named Jesse Chisholm during the Civil War. Now, Jesse Chisholm was an Indian trader, and he was in the vicinity of what is now Wichita, Kansas. He blazed a trail south to the Red River along the northern edge of Texas. Well, it was this trail that these cattle followed up to Abilene.
In the dust and sweat of driving cattle, something important was happening. Traces of the Spanish vaquero were disappearing. The American cowboy was being born. Poet Waddy Mitchell remembers what it must have been like.
There ain't nothing like the feeling that you get down deep inside as you trot out in the morning when you've hired on to ride. Your mount's enthusiastic and the air is crisp and new and there's lively conversation going on amongst the crew. There's some bridle crickets chirping. Jingle bobs tap out a tune on one side the sun is rising, just ahead there sets the moon. Shadows high trot there beside you, elongated, keeping pace, reassuring you ain't hobbled by restrictive time or space. Out in front, the boss is posting to the same beat as his song. The realization hits you. You're right where you belong.
But few days passed without danger. That was part of the attraction. In the same way the sea lured men from Marblehead and Nantucket, the challenge of cattle on the prairie appealed to young men of the West. Some notes from the trail.
Upset our wagon in the river and lost many of our cooking utensils. Was on my horse the whole night, and it was raining hard. There was one of our party drowned today. Several narrow escapes. I among them. Many men in trouble. Horses all give out, and men refuse to do anything. Awful night. Not having had a bite to eat for 60 hours. Tired. Indians very troublesome. Ooh, what a night. Thunder, lightning, and rain. We followed our beeves all night as they wandered about. Hauled cattle out of the mud with oxen half the day. Hands all growling and swearing, everything wet and cold. Sick and discouraged. Found a human skeleton on the prairie today.
Tremendous extremes in weather tested the cowboy's survival, not to mention his horses and cattle. Snow, rain, hailstorms would pound them into the mud. Dust clouds would suffocate them. And in the open plains, tornadoes sent them running. Droughts and floods. They learned to fear the prairie fire, what the Osage called the red buffalo. Those who made it through a cattle drive often swore it would be their last.
They don't tell you about it, but a lot of those old boys dropped out after a few hundred miles. They couldn't take the pressure, you know. And of course, you think everybody that signed up that went all the way to Montana, they, like anything else, they thought they could handle it, and it got too rough for them.
Much too rough for some.
Another jolly cowboy has gone to meet his fate. We hope he'll find a resting place inside the Golden Gate. Another's place is vacant on the range of XIT. We'll never find another who's like so well as he.
At the end of the day on the trail, not all cowboys bedded down. Someone had to watch the herd. It was on these lonely nights on the trail that many a song came to life. Cows would sing to the cowboy. The cowboys sang to the cows.
Go to sleep, you weary cowboy. Let the herd drift slowly by. Can't you hear the cattle lowing? That's the cowboy's lullaby.
The singing cowboy really evolved from those nights on the trail when the animals were bedded down And cowboys would ride around the herd on horseback, and they would hum to themselves, and they would do that so that the animals that were about to go to sleep would know someone was coming. If the cowboy didn't hum and suddenly maybe the horse stepped on a twig and broke it, it could stampede the herd.
A stampede is the natural result of fear, and at night, it might spread to an entire herd by a flash of lightning or a peal of thunder. It occurred during our guard about 2 o'clock in the morning. John Officer's horse struck a gopher hole with his front feet, and in a moment, he was on the ground. Suddenly, the sleeping herd was on its feet, and they were off like a flash. There were about 50 or 60 big steers in the lead, and we opened up in front of them with our six-shooters shooting into the ground and managed to head them the other way. It took us 2 days to get the herd back together. I didn't eat the whole time, but comfort was nothing for us. The cows meant money.
Money was always a worry. At no time more risky than pushing cattle through a drought. You never forget that one.
The day had turned out to be one of torrid heat, and before the middle of the afternoon, cattle hung their tongues in despair. The only relief we could offer was to travel them slowly. Over 3 days it had elapsed without water, and the herd was ungovernable. The herd was going blind. Bones of men and animals lay bleaching along the trail. It was now evident that nothing short of water would stop the herd. This is proof of the man who said, if he owned hell in Texas, he'd rent Texas and live in hell.
That story would have played well around the campfire, set to a fiddle and lively tune, with cowboy lyrics cooked up, riding round the herd at night.
Cowboy music came basically from the southern states, the Irish, Scottish, English folk songs that had been kicking around for centuries. The old Chisholm Trail being one of the oldest. Come along, boys, listen to my tale. Tell you of the troubles on the old Chisholm Trail. Come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yi, yippee-yay. Tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. Well, that dates back 300-400 years. And one rancher, a man who became a college professor, his father was a rancher on the old Chisholm Trail, said that they left a ledger out, and each cowboy who came back down going to the home ranch after a trail drive, if they stopped to eat a meal, they were to write a verse in that ledger, the old Chisholm Trail.
Out on the range with nothing but his horse and the wind against his back, the cowboy had a lot of time for thinking. Like cowboy music, cowboy poetry was coined in their free time, both as entertainment and reflection.
The tradition of cowboy poetry came about because it is an oral tradition. It's storytelling set to rhyme and meter. People, for years and years, everybody recited some. This lifestyle just kind of kept it a little longer because they lived more like people of the last century lived. Think about it. You live around the same people in close proximity for long periods of time. You tell them a story for the third time and they're going to roll their eyes and say, I know, we've already heard it. But if put a rhyme and a meter to it, and like a song, people will listen to it over and over again, and as they get to know it better, it even becomes more endeared to them. Way up high in the Sierra Peaks where the yellowjack pine grow tall, old Sandy, Bob, and Buster Jiggs had a roe deer camp last fall. Now, they'd taken their horses and branding irons, maybe a dog or two. They allowed they'd brand all the long-eared calves that come within their view, and any old doggie that flapped long ears didn't bush up a day, get his long ears whittled and his old hide scorched in a most artistic way.
Years later in their memoirs, cowboys who had driven cattle from Texas to Kansas and Montana, who had become governors and senators, would list the cattle drive as their biggest achievement. For anyone who did it, they'd never forget it. It's not hard to imagine then, after 90 days on the trail, sleeping in the open, never a bath, what happens at the end of the trail? They'd been on a trail for 1,000 miles. It was exhausting, body-breaking work. But each hand had done his job, just as he promised he would. Months in the saddle, usually in the same clothes, boots worn out, hats caked with dirt, and no companionship, except for other cowpokes and their cows. And then on the horizon, civilization.
Boys, anybody want to get the trail dust out of their throats?
Their names were Abilene, Wichita, Hays City, Dodge City, Ellsworth, Ogallala, Caldwell, Baxter Springs, and Elgin. They were the cowtowns. Most were born shabby and looked bedraggled even in prosperity, hastily constructed and cheaply built. They were nothing more than a cluster of fire traps lining a mud quagmire, supposed to be a street. But it didn't matter to a cowboy just off the trail. To them, it was an oasis. The movie makers did a pretty good job recreating this moment, too.
You're paid off at the end of the trail. You want to blow off your steam. They would go to the saloon, but they would go only after they first went in, got a haircut, a shave, and maybe a bath. Then they would go to the saloon, they would drink, they would gamble, and they might visit the ladies of the line, the prostitutes who were in most of these cattle towns at one time or another.
Like sailors going ashore, just before Andy Adams rolled into Dodge City, the boys were given some advice.
I've been in Dodge every summer since '77, and I can give you boys some points. Dodge is one town where the average bad man of the West not only finds his equal, but finds himself badly handicapped. Don't ever get the impression that you can ride your horses into a saloon or shoot out the lights in Dodge City. You may go somewhere else, but it don't go there. So I want to warn you to behave yourselves. You can wear your six-shooters into town, but you'd better leave them at the first place you stop. Hotel, livery, or business house. And when you leave town, call for your pistol, but don't ride out shooting.
Mighty good advice, but a little hard to follow after weeks on the trail.
What's the trouble? There's going to be a shooting.
This image was born in the cowtown, of one man standing up against evil. It may be the most enduring picture we have of the cowboy, whether it's true or not, and perhaps how we'd like to be.
Make it fast, Slippery. This is your last draw. You'll never handle guns again, Morgan. Right through the ribs.
You better get him over to the doctor.
It's become an American allegory, a bad man with a gun, killing innocents, the shocked observer. And notice how justice is settled with a gun. And that picture of the cowboy was largely a myth created by Hollywood.
I think Hollywood westerns and novels that originated in the East gave a misconception about violence.
Go after it, Jip.
You didn't have as many violent deaths in the cow town that most people think.
This is one of my men.
He went for his gun first.
In 5 of the principal Kansas cattle towns, over a 5-year period, there were only 45 violent deaths. In 35 of those, you had an actual weapon drawn against the other person who was shot. The rest of them were ambushes.
The gunslinging cowboy's not accurate. You can't tell me that, that those guys back in Dodge City, when a gun's pointing at them, would act that cool. The guy's gonna kill you.
Most cowboys were not good with guns. People who were good with guns were those who were outlaw or lawmen. Those were the people. Cowboys generally carried them, and most of the time they didn't carry them while they worked, but they would have a gun in case they needed for a rattlesnake or a coyote, or maybe even to try to defend themselves. But Hollywood has made cowboys and guns very synonymous with one another, and that generally was not the case.
Not all cow towns were violent, crude, and primitive. Even in old San Antonio, where many cattle drives and cowboys passed through, there was an occasional oasis of luxury. Here in the famous Menger Hotel, almost in the shadows of the walls of the Alamo, cowboys took refuge at the famous Menger Bar. They were greeted by a fancy and expensive interior, music, and most importantly, great companionship. Often they were none other than Charles Goodnight, Sam Maverick, and even Teddy Roosevelt. Even today, you can step into history. Inside the dark wood-paneled interior, you can sense their presence, their relief and thirst from the dusty trails, and the conversations, they say, still take place. As the northern ranges opened up to Texas longhorns, men like Charles Goodnight and John Wesley Iliff saw a whole new way of raising cattle in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. They built huge outfits by wintering cattle on hay, then developing windmill irrigation and shifting to other cattle breeds like the Shorthorn and Durham. They emphasized quality over quantity. For the cowboy, this required a gentler approach to livestock, and it meant that operations in the cold weather and difficult terrain required a different approach. Regional variations developed with their equipment and apparel. Montana cowboys chose long coats made of buffalo hide to fight the cold. They didn't need the chaps worn in Texas. There was no mesquite in Montana. The Plains cowboy favored wider hats and bigger saddles. While on the open range of Texas, the challenge was with intense heat, insects, and miles of dry country. Cowboys of the northern range had to drive their cattle in before blizzards and Arctic cold swept in. And yet, if luck and skill played its role, there was greater opportunity to succeed in the north. The grass was good, and eventually, railroads came to them. By the mid-1880s, the zenith of the American cowboy was at hand. It had been 20 years since the Civil War. Cowboys had driven 10 million cattle out of Texas. Most of the cow towns prospered for about 5 years and then blew away or found something else to do. And yet, the cowboy story from that time would become America's favorite. When the trail drives ended, some cowboys settled into ranching. They had found their calling, and they were now rich, not in money, but with a special connection to the land.
Here you go, young feller. Let me take this saddle off your back. I'll get you a scoop of rolled oats. We'll have us an evening chat. Now let me curry some of this sweat off. I suppose that's the least I can do. Settle down now. Enjoy your grain. I'll turn you out when we're through. Well, we finished us up another day. That old sun is going down. Huh. Wonder why we say that when it's the earth that's spun around, because the sun is stationary. You see, it's a, what is that? Boredom in your eyes? I guess it don't make no difference to you if we call it sundown or earth rise. But regardless, we had us a good day. And I got what I needed to done. Neither one of us got hurt, and we managed to have us some fun.
Our wannabe cowboys are 4 days into their cattle drive, and they're still alive. Although 2 of them have dropped out and headed back to Georgia, where it's warmer.
You have to be here to realize the harshness of the land. Like we slept under a tent today. It was freezing. No power, none of these amenities, and yet we love it. It's harsh, but it makes you connect with the environment in a way that is unthinkable otherwise.
Seems our greenhorns are getting a feel of what it's like to be a real cowboy.
You're always doing something different. If you can catch the horses in the morning or move the cattle the way you're supposed to, and at the end of the day, you usually feel like you've achieved something. And it's pretty hard work, physical work, and that's what I think most people like about it.
The job of the real cowboy is hard work. So when he does get a day off, he'll just lean back and take it easy, right? If there is anything left of the true Wild West, it would be rodeo. Not much has changed with the skill of riding a bronc or roping a calf, except maybe the cash prizes that can now run into the millions. Today, many cowboys are often only working this circuit and not in a cowpen on the ranch. But it's a sport that was born on the ranch. It had to do with the skills that each cowboy had to have. Before rodeo, there was the roundup. Today, ranches still have these roundups to bring the cattle together, usually in the spring and fall. This is a big part of the cowboys' work, separating and weaning calves from their mothers. Sorting calves and cows that go to market. And, of course, branding them. If someone came at you with a hot piece of iron, they'd have to hold you down, too. This typical ranch work goes with the territory of being a working cowboy. It's only natural that cowboys would want to know who's best, who's the fastest, who can rope and ride with skill. So in their free time, they set up a little competition. And it wasn't long before these friendly leisure contests turned into organized roundup rodeo events, which still exist today. Working ranch rodeos try to stay true to what the beginning of rodeo was like. A bunch of ranches getting together for competition and events that mimic their real cowboy work.
9,000 plus it could be on the agenda.
But whether working ranch or professional rodeo, it's still dangerous.
When cowboys get a day off, they want to rope and ride, which are the two most difficult, dangerous parts of their job. You can get crippled or killed roping or riding.
But danger is what people come to see.
They're dancing. All right. Down hard on the W for the Raymond jeans. Here we go with the bareback ride. Help them be there. Look at that free hand reaching for the Wyoming sky. Look at him ride.
Events like these grew up early. One of the first took place in Prescott, Arizona in 1888. They had roping and riding events where contestants paid a fee to enter and got paid cash prizes. When spectators paid an entry fee to watch, modern rodeo was born. And it wasn't only men who competed in these early rodeos. The term cowgirl appeared in print by the early 1890s. On small ranches, everyone helped with the cattle. Daughters grew up riding and roping right alongside their brothers. Women even competed in bronc riding and roping competitions. Lucille Mulhall is often considered to be America's first cowgirl. She won $1,000 by out-roping the men in a Texas rodeo in 1903 and became the first professional rodeo cowgirl. One of today's most popular rodeo events started out a little differently in the early days. Bill Pickett, son of a South Carolina slave, invented bulldogging, today called steer wrestling. His unique way of wrestling the steer and then biting the upper lip to keep it down became a favorite. It was imitated by many and even performed in the 101 Wild West show. Rodeo was clearly turning into a spectator sport. These famous Wild West shows folded in the early rodeo, which showcased the cowboy's skills. But it was here that the Great West reality merged with the imagination. The two most famous were the Miller Brothers' 101 Ranch and Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. They featured over 1,000 performers each. Cowboys and cowgirls, sharpshooters and bucking horses, bull riders, trained buffalo, equestrian acrobats, and musicians. One of the best-known Western images of the 18th century was Buffalo Bill Cody.
There was no American of his generation who was better known than Buffalo Bill, not only in the United States, but worldwide. The fact that he could put up a poster of a buffalo with his own image in a cameo and the words, "I am coming," and everybody knew what that meant without him even saying, Buffalo Bill is coming. Gives you some idea of how influential and important he was. It also is a testimony to the power of his idea for a Wild West that would introduce the cowboy, and the Indian, and the frontier. It was not real, but on the other hand, it was entertaining.
People were fascinated. They wanted to see Annie Oakley, who was a crack shot, a girl who shot a rifle. It wasn't limited to the United States. Buffalo Bill took his Wild West show to Europe, performed before crown princes. This was the appeal that the American frontier had late in the 19th century. And then what happened? you had the first motion picture.
Wild West shows took the experience of the West and shaped it into a marketable product. And these shows were the springboard into one of the most lucrative motion picture genres ever. The vast appeal of the Wild West shows laid the groundwork for the Western film industry, and the marketing of the cowboy would bring the biggest change. Both the dime novel and the Western have, without a doubt, helped to take the experience of the West and bring it to the masses. The man with a 10-gallon hat and cowboy boots is recognizable all over the world. But as the cowboy entered the popular culture, the other cowboy was often missing. And the myth of the cowboy took on a life of its own.
The Western writers who came to the West discovered the cowboy, and the cowboy, of course, was unique. Here was a man who worked and did his job from atop a cow pony. He wore a hat, he wore boots, he wore spurs, he was different. He was even armed. He might even have a knife in addition to a 6-gun, maybe a rifle. So here was this colorful figure, and this figure was what people in the East began to crave more about.
These Eastern writers gave them what they wanted, and they tended to embellish. Inexpensive serial fiction or dime novels that featured the West and made heroes of its players were a widespread success. The image of the cowboy jumped off the pages and hooked the popular imagination. The freedom of the cowboy had seemed to elevate him to a higher role. The nomadic life of the early Texas cattle drives helped propel this.
The drovers bringing cattle up the old Chisholm Trail to Abilene, met there by the journalists who were sending stories back to things like Leslie's Magazine or Harper's Magazine, describing what happened when the Texas cattle hit the towns, created the image of the cowboy in the popular mind.
These stories presented cowboys not as men who tended cows, but as great adventurers, free and wild. From here, Hollywood would take the image and run. Since the first Western film, The Great Train Robbery in 1903, over 7,000 Westerns have been made in the United States alone. The movies gave us a cowboy that was larger than life.
All right, get your hands up.
The real life of the cowboy wasn't always movie material. But let's face it, the Hollywood Western wasn't meant to be a documentary.
Cut! That does it, boys.
The cowboy in real life, if you followed him around with a camera, it'd be kind of boring because, you know, he's either fixing fence or he's doctoring cattle or something. So the Western had to romanticize it a lot.
Director John Ford knew this well. One of the most respected directors in the business, he's given us many of the classic Westerns.
The Westerns were meant to be entertainment. And John Ford, when he'd shoot a Western, a lot of people have said, you know, that John Ford was a stickler for authenticity. But he wasn't really. He romanticized it. In many of the movies that I worked in with him, you wore your own boots. They weren't period boots. He said if they're looking at your feet, you're in bad shape anyway.
Well, I think they did the best they could. The films, to make something marketable is a lot different sometimes than the history. You have to doctor it up a little bit.
Richard Farnsworth and Harry Carey Jr. have spent their careers making Western films. They may not always have been accurate, but there were a few that came close.
Red River was probably as close to history Howard Hawks did. We did it in '46. I doubled Montgomery Clift on that. And I think the wardrobe, the chuck wagon, the cattle, and everything was about as close as you could get. And it still, to me, holds up as probably the best Western cattle picture that's ever been made. And I know Lonesome Dove was darn good.
Look at the captain.
The 1989 television miniseries Lonesome Dove is often cited as one of the most historically accurate Westerns to date. The epic story of two former Texas Rangers who decide to move cattle from the South up to Montana gives an authentic portrayal of the hardships these trail cowboys endured. Blistering heat and blinding sandstorms, blizzards and freezing temperatures, weeks in the saddle, and treacherous river crossings. The Western was at its core a narrative that sought to bring a certain hero to the audience that was set in the epic West. These movies provided an escape for the public to a far more independent time, just as life on the open range in the West did for the cowboy. Gene Autry, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and Roy Rogers, to name just a few, have brought us face to face with the legendary, though often mythical, cowboy.
I'm back in the saddle again.
From 1934 to 53, Autry popularized the musical Western and became the first successful singing Western star. His trademark Back in the Saddle Again has sold over 45 million copies.
Whoopie-tie-I-O, rocking to and fro, back in the saddle again.
The singing cowboy era of the 30s and 40s brought us a light-hearted version of the cowboy that was not necessarily true to life, but they did provide America with something it needed at the time.
Well, those were the days. Too bad the West isn't wild anymore.
The singing cowboy is a total separate thing from the Red River type of cowboy. But this country needed something like that.
The movie Cowboy stood for everything that was good and noble.
Hey, what's going on here? Running wild horses if it's any of your business. Get up. Well, well, I might have known. Roy Rogers, the movie cowboy. Yeah, get up.
It was kind of a fantasy cowboy. And they wore bright, flashy clothes, but they drew in a lot of people. I mean, people just loved to watch those. I enjoyed watching them very much.
I know you haven't come here. I got a message for you.
I'll leave be, Hondo. I can't make no money scouting.
All these other fellas will excuse you. Come on over to the bar.
I won't. I'm out almost $100.
Well, that figures with Buffalo in the gate.
Wait a minute.
These shirts are hard to come by.
What'd you hit me for?
'Cause I know you.
Leather it!
No single figure quite embodied the West like John Wayne. We called him Duke, and he became the greatest cowboy of them all. His characters were not the white hat good guy, but rather a tougher and often fierce Western hero.
Don't say it's a fine morning or I'll shoot you.
It's difficult to imagine the history of the Western without him. Wayne presented an enduring image that has since been equated with the ideal American cowboy, and by many as the ideal American.
He was a man's man. That's the way we used to describe him in the early days.
When you work with Wayne, I worked in 11 movies with John Wayne.
Well, look who's here.
When he first walked on the set, it was like you first saw him in your life. A movie star. He was the movie star, and the best Western movie star there ever was.
I haven't lost my temper in 40 years. But, Pilgrim, you caused a lot of trouble this morning. Might have got somebody killed. And somebody ought to belt you in the mouth. But I won't. I won't. The hell I will.
John Wayne was it. I don't think anyone that ever worked in motion pictures had the impact that John Wayne had. It's a little mystical in a way. Even today, he's as popular as he was when he was alive. He had that quality about him that just drew people to him.
But John Wayne was a movie cowboy.
You know, a lot of people look at picture shows and TVs and see cowboys, but those are different type of cowboys.
We don't hear as much about them, but other cowboys also made the trail drives and fought the bandits. The African American, Hispanic, and Native American cowboys who hit leather right alongside their Anglo cowhands.
The ethnicity of the cowboy doesn't exist in the popular image. There were probably some cowboys who did look a little like John Wayne. But if you go back before that episode, before the episode of the Civil War and all of the discharged Confederate soldiers coming out west to be cowboys, the most typical American cowhand was of mixed racial origin, in many cases triracial, African, Spaniard, Indian.
Along the coastal bend of Texas, nearly a fourth of the cowboys pushing cattle up the Texas trails in the 1840s were black. The O'Connor Ranch has employed many generations of black cowboys. A few of the old-timers are still around to share their stories with us.
I started working ranch when I was around 10 years old. I lived there on the ranch. My father was a foreman, and I stayed. And then my grandfather, he was the cook there on the ranch.
When I was a cowboy, I was about 8, 9 years old, cowboying. I used to ride behind my daddy. He ride the passage ride behind him.
Tony, going on 94, remembered his cowboying days like yesterday. The stories from these old-timers are slowly disappearing. Tony passed away shortly after we spoke with him. In his 40 years on the range, he'd never trade a day as a cowboy. Their job was no different than any other cowhand.
Back in my days and time, cowboy was a tough job. It was from cane to cane. Can't see in the morning, you can't see at night. So that's the kind of life I lived way back there.
If the black cowboy was left out of the picture, the Native Americans were included, but not often very accurately. Most movies and dime novels depict bloodthirsty savages swooping down on innocent pioneers. Meet Gabe Lopez, the real Native American cowboy.
A lot of people still think that Native Americans are still out there riding with painted ponies, riding with a blanket. They don't realize that a lot of the Native American cowboys have worked on ranches and picked up a lot of the ranch lifestyle.
The Spanish missions in Southern California and Texas trained Native Americans in the ways of the vaquero. These mission Indians in California provided the manpower for the cattle empire, which by 1834 included 400,000 head of cattle, herded by 30,000 native and Spanish vaqueros.
American Indians always seem to be the bad guys in the cowboy films. It's cowboys versus Indians. And so often you hear about American Indian kids when they were growing up years ago and they were rooting for the cowboys rather than the Indians because the cowboys were the good guys and the Indians were the bad guys. And of course, the real story is more complicated and more interesting than that.
Hollywood didn't create the cowboy, but with the aid of film and television, the cowboy has galloped across the imagination of the world. Even though at times it exaggerated or embellished, adding to the myth, the heart of the Western and Wild West shows celebrated the cowboy, ensuring that the legend would live forever. And live forever it has. The image is used to hawk everything, from cigarettes and guns to restaurants and even fertilizers. The Marlboro Man is probably the most renowned advertising campaign. The romantic image of the hard-working and independent cowboy, implying that if you smoke, maybe you'll enjoy the independent lifestyle too. The cowboy's life wasn't exactly riding into the sunset, but they did tap into the spirit. This is the image of the American cowboy we're so familiar with, the Texas cowboy. The Montana cowhand. The California hand. But even further west than California, you'll find cowboys in the most unexpected place. Way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the beautiful islands of Hawaii hold part of the history of the cowboy that's often unknown. Kindy Sproat has seen the shock on many a cowboy's face.
The guy looked up there and he looked at me and he says, "Hi, partner." I said, "Hi." He says, "Where you from?" I said, "Hawaii." He said, "Hawaii?" He said, "Do they got cows out there?" He said, I didn't know they had cows, let alone cowboys."
In fact, Hawaii's cowboys were some of America's first, developing a few decades earlier than in the western states.
I think people think Hawaii is, palm trees and hula girls. And I don't think they really realize the industry that we have here.
One of the largest cattle-producing ranches in the United States is on the Big Island of Hawaii, the Parker Ranch. One of over 600 ranches in Hawaii, the Parker Ranch today is the fourth largest in the United States. Ranching on the Big Island isn't all sunshine and sandy beaches. Working cattle and horses over green lava fields is a challenge. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, and there is one big difference. The Hawaiian cowboys are working in lush green hills instead of arid Texas pastures. And these guys go all out all the time. These cowboys have been working their entire lives here in Hawaii. The skill passed down from generation to generation.
I've been doing it when I was a small kid. I used to go with my dad, and when I was 3 years old, he used to tie me on a horse, and from that day on, I'm doing it now.
Hawaiian ranching goes back to 1793, when a gift of 5 cattle were given to King Kamehameha the Great.
The first cattle arrived by a captain named Vancouver, who brought as a gift a handful of cattle, a bull or 2 and a couple of 3 heifers. And the intent of the king in wanting to place a taboo on killing those cattle or consuming those cattle was to try and cause the cattle to increase and multiply safely.
Like pre-Civil War Texas, the animals roamed and multiplied for 2 decades. Eventually, they had to be rounded up and corralled. Like so many enterprising cowboys before him, John Palmer Parker saw a market in replenishing visiting ships with staples, like beef. Parker's good fortune continued. He married the king's granddaughter and was given a royal gift of land, which became the base for Parker to domesticate and breed a small herd. In the 1830s, King Kamehameha III, appreciating the growing market for beef, sent for Mexican, Indian, and Spanish vaqueros to teach the Hawaiians how to handle horses and cattle. They came to be known as Paniolos.
The name Paniolo came when vaqueros came here. They called themselves Española because they were Spanish cowboys. And so the Hawaiians picked it up and they call him Paniolo. Paniolo just for Española. And so that became the name, a cowboy. So we're known as a cowboy is Paniolo.
Their name may come from Spain, but it was vaqueros of old Mexico that were the primary influence, bringing all their traditions with them, even the guitar, which would later inspire the ukulele, the symbol of the islands.
It was profound that if we put ourselves in the minds and in the souls of those Mexican cowboys that came here, they must have been so gratified to find a person that immediately grasped cowboy life, that immediately grasped a rope, that took the equipment of the Mexican cowboy.
They had the cattle on the run. These new cowboys learned their craft well. Their isolation helped to evolve distinct variations in their gear and techniques. One being a unique way to ship their cattle. The Paneolos would drive the cattle down from the hills to the beaches. And then they would swim the cattle out to longboats, which would take them out to the waiting ship.
From my point of view, I was only a youngster, sitting up on the side watching, and the pens were right on the beach. They'd come out dragging those cows right out of the chute with the dogs right behind them. They have dogs that nip at them, and those cows just take off, jump in the water. Once they get in the water, they have to swim.
One by one, they were hauled aboard. Sonny Kiakialani has been working his entire life as a Paneolo here in Hawaii. He has followed in his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather's footsteps. He knows that working the cattle and being a part of the land is the only way of life for him.
You love doing what you're doing, you know. Like I say, mainly as long as you know what you're doing, you know. Like me, I love it. Probably I go till I die, I'd be doing it.
Loving their work is something that is easily said by most cowboys.
As a cowboy, it broke my body, but, you know, head to toe and toe back up to the head, but it's very special to me.
We can tell, even in the way he rides.
You gotta love it. We have our own style, and we were taught, I guess, from our grandpas and great-grandpas. Have 3 lovely children. My children love horses, working with cattle, and it's a clean life. When we work, we're proud, we're strong. It's one thing, we're strong. I get plenty heart, plenty guts, no scared. Maybe we don't have plenty of money, but I'm happy.
Plenty of heart, plenty of guts, the main ingredients to the American cowboy. And in Hawaii, it's no different. The Paneolos are some of the best around. Poetry and song, dime novels, and westerns have solidified the legend of the American cowboy. But the real cowboy was colorful and was romantic long before writers exaggerated his life. It's this legend that draws people from all over the world.
the cowboy represents America. It's the simplicity of it. You know, he's a good guy, and he's strong, and he's honest. And a handshake is his word. And that's good enough for me.
What is it that draws people to the American West? Perhaps that's where the Western or cowboy movies have actually helped, because it talks about the wide open spaces, it talks about self-reliance, it talks about initiative and creativity and courage.
The National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City has made preserving the past, our Western heritage, its mission, paying tribute to the men and women who settled and developed the Great West. It allows all of us, cowboy or city slicker, to experience it for ourselves.
I think people come and visit and also participate in the program at the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Center based on one word in our title, cowboy.
One of our main goals in the creation of the American Cowboy Gallery was to try to bring the story to the American public about how varied the story of the West was, how colorful it was, how many different regional traditions, how many different peoples were involved, vaqueros, the black cowboys, the Native American cowboys, the Irish cowboys, the English cowboys.
They come to experience what the West was all about. I think there's a tremendous intrigue with people to learn more about the cowboy, to understand the cowboy, and to relate his relationship with the land and how he was involved in the land and what really produced the country.
This connection to the land is a window to the soul of the cowboy. Once it stretched out on a vast open prairie, and the challenge was making it past the obstacles it presented. But now the wide open ranges of the cowboy's heyday are fenced in. The cowboy has been forced to evolve as the modern world encroaches. Today's cowboy now trailers his horse to start work. And often, instead of a horse, he mounts his helicopter to round up cattle and horses. But as the cowboy is forced to change, the question remains, is he a dying breed?
I don't think that the cowboy is a dying breed, because as long as there's one cow left, there's going to be one potential cowboy out there looking after it.
Unlike those who say the cowboy's a dying breed, the cowboy's alive and well, and will be here until we finally pave over the whole West.
Though the work of the cowboy may change, there is one thing for sure. The spirit of the cowboy will be around forever. And there will always be people who want to be one, just like our city slickers in Montana.
It's the way of life out here, I suppose. It's quite a simple way of life, yet you're really doing something, feels like. Every day there's a challenge.
What I'll get out of this week is probably outside of a sore butt is going to be memories that will last decades, literally. The landscape, the people, the cattle, the horses, all things that are impossible to find in Europe and are absolutely fascinating for us.
Everybody, all the kids growing up, it's America, it's tradition, and I grew up as a little boy wishing I could be a cowboy, never dreaming that I would, but the West is, well, it's really a state of mind.
What will I tell him, he asked me, when my son's trying to make up his mind to ride for a living like I have, or explore what the world has to find? Could I tell him it's sure worth the doing? Could I tell him I spent well my time? I'll just say from the start, son, it's got to come from the heart. It ain't something that comes from the mind. I'll tell him the cowboy's a verb, not a noun. It's what you do more than a name. He'd be fooling himself if he's figuring on any sort of material gain. But then I'll remind him of spring calves a-bucking, of the joy and the pride and the pain, of living a life that is easy or hard at the discretion at nature's refrain. What will I tell him, he asks me, when he's there, trying to make up his mind? I'll just say from the start, son, it's got to come from the heart. It ain't something that comes from the mind.